USS Enterprise, CVN-65, is the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. To this day, she is still the fastest, farthest-ranging ship in the United States Navy. But it's raw courage and not high-tech weaponry that saves her in her deadliest hour. A horrific accident off the coast of Hawaii sweeps flaming jet fuel and exploding ordnance across her decks. What kind of crew bands together to save a ship engulfed in fire? What kind of captain refuses to let the ship go down? The crew of the USS Enterprise faces a terrible trial by fire. Carrier aircraft pack a volatile mix of jet fuel, oxygen, and hydraulic fluids. They are stuffed with deadly loads of ordnance ranging from cannon shells to rockets to bombs. Jammed together on and under the deck, each plane is a disaster waiting to happen if just one misguided move sets off a fatal reaction of fire and flame. Every sailor serving on this Enterprise is aware of what happened to her on January 14, 1969, when a deadly fire tore through her deck. Few of the 235-year-old line of ships named Enterprise could ever claim such losses. The first USS Enterprise started life as a British supply ship, the George. In 1774, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, she was captured by the Americans, renamed Enterprise, and put in service as a warship. Over the decades, 5 more Enterprises saw service with the Navy. Typical of the ferocious heritage is the third Enterprise, a 12-gun, 135-ton schooner, launched in Baltimore in 1799 and quickly into 24 years of battle action.
In 1799, she sailed down to the Caribbean to confront French privateers who were making raids on American merchantmen. She captured at least 8 French privateers and recaptured at least 11 American merchantmen, which was quite an achievement and led to her being nicknamed the Lucky Little Enterprise. 1801 found us embroiled in the Barbary Wars with the pirates of North Africa. She engaged with the Barbary pirate ship Tripoli, which was one of their finest ships. And after a 3-hour engagement with those guys, they had soundly beaten the pirates. They had killed or wounded at least 50 of their people. The last war that Enterprise No. 3 saw action in was the War of 1812. She was cruising off the coast of Maine and came across the very famous HMS Boxer, a ship of equivalent class to the Enterprise. They engaged in a very, very long battle that ultimately killed both of the captains of the ships. But Enterprise prevailed and captured the Boxer and sailed into Portland, Maine with her prize. Both of the captains were highly respected in their own services and received a common funeral. The 7th Enterprise was a Yorktown-class aircraft carrier. Her site numbers were CV6.
Enterprise, the word itself means bold initiative with risk. And there's probably no better definition that could describe the life of the aircraft carrier Enterprise CV6. In 1934, the keels were laid for both the Yorktown and for the Enterprise, and the building process began at Newport News.
This Enterprise is 809 feet long, with a flight deck beam of 114 feet. She carries 88 aircraft, ranging from fighters to dive bombers and torpedo bombers. Pre-war, she is armed with 8 5-inch guns distributed along her gallery deck. Her secondary anti-aircraft batteries are numerous but undersized, fast-firing 1.1-inch guns in quad mounts and a scattering of 50 caliber machine guns. She is highly maneuverable, and her propulsion system can drive her at a brisk 32 knots. In the early 1940s, building war tensions with the Japanese Empire places Enterprise in the Pacific. Her assignment is to transport warplanes to American island bases. She is carrying an aggressive admiral who is prepared for war with all of its perils, should it come.
The admiral on board the Enterprise is Admiral William F. Halsey. A lot of people call him Bull. He did not like that. He was Bill. He was a sailor's sailor. The men loved him even before the war. He had no second thoughts about what was going to happen. He felt that the United States and Japan would be at war, and they would be at war soon. The last mission that the Enterprise goes on before the attack on Pearl Harbor, she's supposed to carry 12 Marine planes to Wake Island. Before they leave port, Halsey has Captain Murray issue to all hands what is known as Battle Order Number 1, that this is not another voyage just to deliver planes, that everybody needs to be ready. If they sight anything that's carrying the Japanese flag, they're going to attack it. They're going to defend themselves. So Bill Halsey is at war on November the 28th, 1941.
We had gone to Wake Island with a squadron of Marine Corps fighter planes, and we dropped them off at Wake and immediately turned around and headed back toward Pearl Harbor. And on December the 3rd, we ran into a terrific storm.
Everyone is quite disappointed that they're not going to get back in time for the Liberty on Saturday night. So the new arrival time now is Sunday morning, December the 7th. As the Enterprise is approaching Pearl Harbor, she's coming in from the west, unaware of the fact that the Japanese task force is due north by nearly the same distance from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese only have 6 fleet carriers at the time, and all 6 of them are launching nearly 360 planes toward Pearl Harbor.
Our planes had gone to fly into the Naval Air Station in Pearl Harbor because we always let the planes go in ahead of the ships. And many of them were attacked, and several of them were shot down that day by friendly anti-aircraft fire as well as Japanese planes.
Before the day is over, Enterprise will lose 9 planes, and they have 6 pilots who are killed.
We got a teletype or some type of a radio message that said, "Pearl Harbor under attack. This is no drill." And shortly thereafter, 3 cruisers and a couple of destroyers came sailing over the horizon. And our executive officer said, "Look out there, boys. That is what's left of the fleet after the Japanese have done their job on us." And we were pretty much discouraged about that time. But we went out and looked for the enemy as best we could, and of course we couldn't find it because they were long gone. So we waited until almost dark the night of December 8th to steam into port, and that was quite a scene. The smells, the sights, just the general atmosphere was just one of absolute discouragement. It normally took us about 20-some hours to completely resupply the ship, but we managed in about 5 to 7 hours, something like that as I recall it.
On December 10th, Enterprise records America's first kill of a Japanese warship in World War II, as her planes sink the patrolling Imperial Navy submarine I-70 off Oahu. By February 1st, 1942, with the war going badly, Enterprise fights in what is called the offensive defensive. She makes fast raids on the Japanese-held Gilbert and Marshall Islands.
The Japanese are not expecting them. The raid comes off as planned. There is a good bit of damage that's done to the shipping there at Kwajalein. Only a handful of planes, Japanese planes, are able to get up in the air and to challenge. When the Enterprise and the Yorktown come back from the Marshall's raid, horns are blaring, whistles are blowing, there are cheers, there are shouts. You would have thought that the Yorktown and the Enterprise had gone off and won the war against Japan by themselves. The major purpose was for morale, because morale was at dead bottom.
Well, I'll tell you, it's as though a boxer had been knocked down about 9 times in the first 9 rounds, and then the 10th round comes around, and it was our turn. Boy, that was just such a wonderful feeling, because we just smashed that place to bits.
She sails with the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in 1942. Hornet's flight deck is crammed with 16 twin-engine Army B-25 bombers to launch the attack. Enterprise and her contingent of fighters provides all the air cover to the American task force. The tiny raid is little more than another morale builder, but in a few short weeks, Enterprise is to be at the heart of the turning point battle of the Pacific War. On June 3, 1942, Enterprise is one of just 3 American carriers preparing to hurl themselves into a surprise attack on a gigantic Japanese task force sailing to invade Midway Island. Japanese success will grant them naval dominance in the Pacific. The American carrier forces, still undiscovered by the Japanese, launch their planes at long range to search for an enemy hidden by distance on a vast ocean. For long hours, the desperate search is in vain.
The Enterprise Air Group commander ran into the same problem that the Hornet Air Group commander had. They got to a point where they thought the Japanese were, where the last report was, where they could find them. Well, whereas the Hornet Group turned and went back toward Midway, Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey looks down to the water to see which way the wind is blowing. He knows that the Japanese carriers are going to have to turn into the wind, whether they're launching their planes or whether they're landing them. So he then turns and goes north. This is probably the one greatest decision for the Battle of Midway, because had he turned and gone back to the Enterprise, or had he turned and gone in the direction of the Hornet, the battle would have definitely gone the other way. As he heads off toward the north, he realizes that this is really a desperate gamble. They're starting to run down out of fuel. And after about 15 minutes, he spots a Japanese destroyer, and it is heading in the direction that he's going to. So that pretty much confirms for him now, okay, even if we do run out of fuel, at least we're going to be able to find the Japanese carriers and get some ordnance on them. The Enterprise SPDs have arrived, and they come down in 2 groups. One squadron destroys the Akagi, which is the flagship, both at Pearl Harbor and at Midway. The other places bombs on the Kaga. It's not only the bombs that hit, but for instance, we know that one of the bombs that hit the Kaga landed right beside a mobile fuel tank. And so you not only have the explosive power of the bomb, but this fuel tank goes off too. On the Akaga, one of the bombs lands right next to a stack of torpedoes that had been taken off of the planes while they were rearming it. And so, of course, Kaga goes up in flame.
With the Midway victory behind her, Enterprise goes into the naval meat grinder off the vital beachhead on Guadalcanal. Between August 1942 and February 1943, she fights. Sometimes she is the only usable carrier in the Solomons. Battling alone to help turn back Japanese attacks and preserve the hold on the critical islands, her crew pays in blood.
I was down in the storekeeper's office playing checkers with a good friend of mine. The general quarters alarm rang, meaning we had to rush to our battle stations. But about a dozen, maybe even 14 planes were able to get through the fighter screen and come directly over the good old Enterprise. I looked up and there was a plane directly overhead, and I couldn't tell whether it was one of ours or one of theirs, but it was sort of heading down toward us, and the next thing I know, a little goose egg came dropping out of there, and then it became a grapefruit, and then a watermelon, and I said, hey, it's time for me to get hidden somewhere. And it wasn't long until we felt a blast, a terrific blast. I saw shoes lined up around the gun emplacements, and the men had literally been blown out of those shoes and had disappeared. The following day, we held a memorial service, and of course, there were copious tears shed as taps was played, and those bodies were put in those canvas bags loaded with 5-inch gun shells and dropped to the bottom of the ocean. As I recall it, there were 73 men that lost their lives that day aboard ship.
By 1945 and the war's end, Enterprise has fought her way across the Pacific to victory in dozens of battles, earning the undying name, the Big E. But time and technology doomed the old warship. She is not destined to endure much longer. Progress condemns Enterprise to a fate her enemies could not, silencing her guns and aircraft. The Navy realizes that Enterprise has outlived her usefulness in a post-war world. With her battle-worn hull of 1934 design unfit for modern combat, CV-6 will be scrapped in 1958.
We were absolutely devastated when the ship had to be scrapped. Very little of it was kept, even though the ship's bell is now in place at the Naval Academy in Indianapolis, and it's rung every time Navy defeats Army in football, as I recall. I loved the ship in that day, and I love it today. And I would go across the country if one of my shipmates needed me for anything.
The proud old name Enterprise disappears from the rolls of the U.S. Navy, seemingly forever. But barely 2 years later, she will be reborn. And her new namesake, CVN-65, will be the biggest and most spectacular warship ever. In 1958, Enterprise CV-6 is scrapped. But barely 2 years later, she is reborn as Enterprise CVN-65. Today, the newest Enterprise is almost 50 years old, but she remains the same keystone of the fleet she was on the day she appeared, as a welcome bulwark against the Soviet Union while the Cold War escalated. The first vessel to prove the awesome capability of nuclear power in battle, she has sailed a long way from her beginnings.
It all began really in 1955 when Dennis Wilkinson, the captain of the Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine, sent his very famous message, "Underway on nuclear power." And the Nautilus was such a great success that Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was then the chief of naval operations and a very, very sage man and a great leader, said, "Nuclear power is the thing of the future, and I'd like to have a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier built."
Launched in 1961, everything about CVN-65 dwarfs her predecessor. Where CV-6 stretched some 809 feet, CVN-65 goes on for 1,101 feet. CV-6's 19,800 tons of displacement are a fraction of the new carrier's staggering 85,600 tons.
The idea of being able to put a propulsion system in a ship that would drive it for 10, 15, 20 or more years without having to refuel from a military point of view is phenomenal. In the conventionally powered ships, a large amount of that ship's space had to be dedicated to bunker fuel, or fuel that would be used to drive its own engines. To go nuclear allows designers to devote even more of that space over to commodities that are needed for other warfighting capabilities. As a revolution in shipbuilding, she cost $451 million and change, the most expensive ship ever built. But because she ended up being so expensive, the Navy elected not to build any more of those.
Going into the mid-60s, Enterprise meets her toughest challenge yet. As the fighting in Vietnam heats up, the United States is suddenly faced with an air war over a coastline so long that land-based planes from American bases to the south can't reach distant targets easily. Carriers are needed off the northern coast.
Word came, things are not going well in Vietnam. So the chief of naval operations, Admiral McDonald, said, well, we're going to send Enterprise because she's the most powerful ship we have in the fleet. Admiral McDonald did a very smart thing in getting Enterprise into combat. We could actually measure the increased performance of the ship in a real-life situation rather than with systems analysts going through with scenarios that they had made up. Again, they took advantage of what the Enterprise offered, which was a bigger deck, and the Enterprise could carry 90% more aviation fuel and 50% more aviation munitions than the America, the latest conventional powered ship. So the Navy loaded us up with 2 squadrons of F-4 Phantom IIs and 4 squadrons A-4 Skyhawks. So on the 2nd of December, 1965, the local admiral sent a message and said to the Secretary of the Navy and said, I have the honor to inform you that the first nuclear-powered warship in the history of the United States Navy has conducted combat operations.
On the 3rd of December, the Enterprise flew 165 combat sorties in one day, which was the largest number of combat sorties ever flown in one day by any ship, and it's a record that still stands.
But Enterprise would soon find that the extended deployments made possible by technology would begin to have a human toll.
One night I wasn't watching what I was doing, and I got in between 2 of the ropes, and they took tension, and I was caught in there, and I couldn't get out. We had a little flashlight with a red lens, and I'm waving it to signal that I'm caught under there, and they were turning the plane up to full power. If they wouldn't have seen me and they wouldn't have went to my aid, I would have went along with the plane, and that would have been the end of me.
They were 8, 9, 10, 12 months where you're You know, you're overseas and flying like that for 30 days at a clip. That after 2 weeks, people start getting annoyed. They just start getting surly. And after 3 weeks, now you're having fights breaking out. And then after 4 weeks, now you're having real problems.
But what was supposed to be the Navy's last nuclear carrier impresses officials at the Pentagon. Enterprise has made her mark, but her ordeal in Vietnam is still far from over. Early in 1966, Enterprise is on Yankee Station, the northernmost section of U.S. Navy battle groups who are flying missions inland.
We warmed up in South Vietnam working in close air support for the South Vietnamese and the U.S. military. And then we moved up north to Yankee Station. Right away we had the first Alpha strikes, and that was a large strikes on a power plant outside of Haiphong. I had a second Alpha strike on Hai Dong Bridge, which was outside of Hanoi. So the bombs were coming over from the supply ship by helicopter, putting them on the deck and put right on the airplanes. It was a logistic nightmare. The military never really realized the tremendous increase in firepower that nuclear power brought. 2 minutes before we were going to launch, they would push the nuclear reactors up, and the Enterprise would be just like a speedboat. The back end would go down, the front end would go up, and it would accelerate. When they hit 30, 35 knots, it'd be a little nose down. That's done in 2 minutes. There's no other ship could possibly do anything like that.
But Enterprise is not without her vulnerabilities. Even today, crews train constantly against any ship's worst nightmare: fire.
If we actually had a fire, or if we were actually going to a combat scenario, there would be no difference on what you see that we do on a day-to-day basis as compared to what we do if we were in a real combat scenario. There would be no difference.
But on January 14th, 1969, Enterprise's greatest trial by fire would threaten to overwhelm all of their training. Enterprise hurriedly prepares her flight deck during a fast-paced readiness inspection off Hawaii. In the rapid cycles, fully fueled aircraft loaded with ordnance are packed closely on the after part of the flight deck. They sit behind the Enterprise's 4 catapults, so aircraft can be launched on split-second schedules ahead of returning planes.
A start tractor got too close to a rocket pod of 4 or 5-inch rockets, and the turbine exhaust from the start turbine was too close to them and overheated the warheads, and they blew up. These are 5-inch warheads. 4 of them went off together. The flash temperature of the explosive was 6,000 degrees. Here now we're stuck there. We're standing there with a hose trying to do something. All these aircraft that were punctured from the initial rockets that went off. All that fuel's just pouring out all over the deck. It's on fire. The captain of the ship, He's trying to put the ship into a turn to get the ship into the wind, to blow the flames back aft. And that sent the smoke straight up, covered the sun. It was like doomsday. Everything was so black and dark. Now the bomb started. When these bombs were going off, they were blowing down through the ship and they were blowing through the fire mains. Fire mains were blown through and severed. And you had people at their battle stations. They had to go find these breaks in all the smoke and flame, and they had to bypass them to get water up to the flight deck. With the blast of the bombs, there was 3 distinct phases. The flash, then this rush of shrapnel, and then the sound with this force that just hit me, you know, like the hammer of Thor. And we're watching these flames come, just sweeping underneath of this F4 that's right next to us. And we're trying to hold the flames back with what we got, and there's no stopping them. And I just watch these flames go right under this F4. And I look, there's 6 500-pound bombs on this thing. Here you're stuck there, because what are you going to do? I mean, you can't back up. The water hit the bombs, it just boiled away in steam. So we stood there till it went off. Had it not been for the force of the blast, the flames would have overtaken us. But the blast blew the flames back to such an extent it actually took the flames a while to recover their intensity. Now all this junk's coming down that was blown up into the air, and I'm talking about engine parts, main wheel assemblies, and it's raining down on the flight deck. The A7s, they had 20mm cannons, and all that was blowing off all over the deck. These rounds are hitting everywhere, ricocheting off the flight deck. Then we had 3 rockets in succession fire from one of the A7s on the starboard side. And that ship, we thought we were going to lose it. And the ships that came alongside of us, our 2 destroyer escorts, they thought Enterprise was going to sink. It took about 20 minutes till the weapons were done blowing off. So you have like 25 minutes, 18 detonations. And some of them were only seconds apart. Some of them were maybe a minute and a half apart. The longer time it was between explosions, the more people got up in front of it. Well, after the rockets fired, after the mag wheel explosions were over, it was a piece of cake to put this fire out. The Navy knew everybody had to be a firefighter because these things would happen, and we had to prepare for it. We knew where the stuff was because we had to go get it during training. We knew how to hook this stuff up.
There was 18 detonations of weapons. 15 aircraft were destroyed. 27 men were killed and 343 some were wounded. When we talk about numbers of dead, those numbers can be very cold and it's very sterile. The story of one of those men that died was Paul Akers. He was just 18 years old, the youngest person killed that day. He had to report back to the ship a few days before Christmas. So his mother and his family said, "We will put the Christmas turkey in the freezer, and one day when you come back, we'll all sit down as a family together and have that." I came to know the boy's mother 30 years later, and I got to take her to the spot where her son died. And she told me that the Christmas turkey is still in the freezer waiting for him.
Having survived the equivalent of a savage wartime attack, the toughness of Enterprise and her crew have her back in action in just 3 months, in time to face new dangers. Returning to combat after repairs following her January 1969 fire ordeal, Enterprise begins a series of 7 harrowing deployments in the air war over Vietnam. From 1965 to 1973, she is part of a carrier force sending thousands of sorties against the anti-aircraft artillery, SAM sites, and MiG fighters of the blistering North Vietnamese air defenses. During her Vietnam service, Enterprise flies thousands of combat sorties, losing planes and aircrew in the operations.
I was shot down on my 80th hop a day and a half or 2 days before I was to take command of squadron, and I ended up being a prisoner of war. I had been hit. I had no controls. I was on fire. I'm still climbing, trying to figure out how I could eject in the water and get picked up. At this particular time, I tried to disconnect and go manual, and my aircraft went completely out of control. I had nothing to do but eject. I went out at about 465 knots. I was knocked completely cold. I was captured at that time and wounded. Marched me into a little town and stripped me of everything, including my wedding ring and my watch. And all of a sudden, I understood him say, "You no die today, Yankee dog. You go Hanoi." And that was the first day of 2,522 days, which became more unpleasant as the time went by, you can imagine.
The performance of Enterprise holds the attention of Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford, who reverses the department's stand on the expensive ships. The Navy goes to nuclear power for all new carriers. In the years after Vietnam, Enterprise's war-conditioned days seem well behind her. She is on her way back from watchdog duties in the Arabian Gulf, when her world and ours changes. It is September 11th, 2001.
And on the morning of September 12th, we had 2 U.S. Navy aircraft carriers with all of the associated escorts ready to fight off the southern coast of Pakistan. It was the first time in any of our careers when we were more concerned for our families back home than our families were concerned for us. I told the crew, the last time our country was attacked by surprise, the USS Enterprise in World War II was the first U.S. asset to strike a blow in return against the adversary that had surprise attacked us. We were going to be given the opportunity to do the exact same thing. We were at sea. This time our nation was attacked.
On the evening of October 7th, USS Enterprise joins other carriers to begin her payback, delivering into Afghanistan ordnance bearing grim writings from the crew.
It was a privilege to be out on the pointy end of the spear, if you will, potentially having the opportunity to strike a blow for freedom on behalf of our country.
In late October, Enterprise's military operations in the Gulf come to an end. She she makes the long journey home, unaware of the incredible welcome that awaits her.
It's always an emotional event when an aircraft carrier comes home, when 5,000 to 6,000 sailors arrive home with all their families on the pier and the like. This was probably a notch above that. It was like walking into a college football stadium with the crowd cheering when the ship pulled in. Enterprise is still out there. She's done 2 deployments since I had command of her. Surely this platform must be tired and old and obsolete. But one of the great things about aircraft carriers is you can upgrade them. Every aircraft carrier goes out there with the latest equipment, constantly upgraded.
But the real weaponry on CVN-65 is human, just as in the days of CV-6. The young crewmen never forget for an instant that their job on Enterprise interlocks with all the rest and can turn disastrous in seconds. They're dealing with nuclear reactors, 160-knot landings on moonless nights, heaving seas, hurricane jet blasts, cables under thousands of pounds of lethal pressure, oceans of jet fuel, and tons of bombs and rockets. The crew of this ship knows the price of one misjudgment or mistake, and it's a heavy burden to bear.
My name is Captain Select Ryman Schoaf. I'm the air boss here on the USS Enterprise.
How you doing today, girl? Good to see you. We're going to do another spot check.
Whenever
Are you scared of me now?
No, I'm not scared of you, sir.
You probably heard air bosses being kind of grumpy. Well, I only get 3-4 hours of sleep a night, and if you do that long enough, that'll make anybody grumpy. When it comes to launching aircraft, there is no other flight deck that is faster or even as fast as Big E. The airplane is supposed to be airborne at 1,300. I guarantee you, you stand out here on the catapult, you're going to have airplanes at the end of the stroke at 1,300.
Gillian said 360 on and clear deck.
Gillian said, son, clear that good winds. Left forward.
I want to make sure that we do everything safely with my guys on the flight deck. And when I see someone out there being stupid, I'm usually not very nice about it.
Okay. You got 8 minutes on this guy. Do you even want to try? He's got a depart and re-enter.
Because I'm really not concerned about someone's precious little feelings. I'd much rather have their precious life instead.
Enterprise has been serving for 45 years. It's the longest that name has been on any ship. And she's expected to go perhaps 5 more years. What's going to happen to this Enterprise? What's in the history for it once it is decommissioned? The reactors will have to be removed after she's decommissioned.
347 tower.
And to remove these reactors will literally result in the destruction of this ship.
347 airborne.
Yes, there's a debate on turning her into a museum, but it's probably not likely going to happen because of the way we have to take those reactors out.
I can tell you that Enterprise is special. It'll always be special. Having had the privilege of commanding her will etch her forever in my heart. Any captain of any ship in any service, in any Navy, has to love their crew or they're just not going to get the job done. It's tough to leave something like that behind. It's like leaving your family.
There is nothing in the tons of steel that make up Enterprise that make her special. It is the men and women that serve aboard her that give her a soul. From the first moment they step aboard to the day they die, that inexplicable bond between man and ship endures.